Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Bryce Duskett, and thank you for joining us today on Market Journal. As we're coming back from the recent 4th of July holiday, we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's jump right into the headlines. First, U.S. Senator Deb Fischer recently hosted a roundtable discussion to share an update on her Cattle Price Discovery and Transparency Act. Alex Wojcicki covered that event, and she joins us now. Alex, what does Senator Fischer see as the focus behind that bill?
Yeah, so Bryce, during the beginning of the pandemic, from mid-March to the beginning of April, the spread between box beef prices and fed cattle increased by about 94%. That data released by an investigative report from the USDA in 2020. Now, Senator Fischer said the boxed beef price and fed cattle price spread is one of the main reasons this bill came about.
We all realize that markets cycle. But when you look at the discrepancies out there on what feeders were selling their product to the packers for, they were losing $800 to $1,200 per head. You know, that's not good for them and their families. It's certainly not good for the livestock industry, and it hurts the state of Nebraska. It hurts our economy as well.
The bill, in part, aims to establish minimum levels of negotiated cash trade for fed cattle by dividing up regions of the country. The bill also would create a library at the USDA of AMA contracts that would allow cattle producers to see premiums that others are receiving. Now, groups like the Nebraska Cattlemen and Nebraska Farm Bureau support the legislation. Others, though, like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, are pushing back on it, saying that mandates would limit market opportunities for cattle producers.
And no, I usually am not a fan of any kind of mandate. But I think by making this legislation a regional piece, where it affects region, not nationally, you know, we're all different. So we want to have that regional piece in there. To have that a mandated reporting, I think that's extremely important. So we know what's going on in Nebraska, what the market's doing.
The bill has momentum right now as it passed on a voice vote out of the Senate Ag Committee. Bryce?
So that bill now heads to the full Senate for a vote. Did the senator provide a timeline of when this could be passed and become law?
She did. So she points out that it's an ambitious goal, but Senator Fischer would like to have it on the president's desk for signature by the end of the year.
An ambitious goal indeed. Thank you for that story, Alex. As we move on today, weed control in wheat stubble could prove to be a bit more challenging this year, as weed emergence and growth in post-harvest wheat are expected to be accelerated due to the shorter and thinner wheat. Dryland Cropping Systems Specialist Cody Creech stopped by recently to discuss this challenge and some solutions. Market Journal's Mike Straub brings us this story.
If you've noticed a short, thin wheat crop this year, you can blame the drought. And with drought also comes weeds.
Well, the biggest issue we've had in our wheat production this year has been the drought. And so with the drought comes much shorter wheat as well as a lot thinner wheat. And so there's a lot more opportunity for weeds to grow up because we have less residue production right now.
Weeds will grow rapidly when there is open ground. One way to prevent post-harvest weeds is with good heavy residue in the fields.
So we really rely on a really good heavy residue to not only conserve soil moisture, but also to suppress the weed growth post-harvest. And anytime we have open ground, those weeds are going to take advantage of that open ground and start to grow. And so when we don't have that production that we normally have, like in a year like this, that's when we really get concerned about what's going to happen post-harvest once we cut that wheat.
Once your wheat crop is harvested, it's easy to move on to the next task. It's important not to forget about the potential for post-harvest weeds and preventing them.
One of the biggest challenges we face with wheat is once we harvest that crop, growers get busy, they want to go work on other crops, and they kind of oftentimes forget about that post-harvest weed control. They move on to the next greatest thing, and when you think about corn crops or other crops, you know, we're harvesting late in the year. There's not an opportunity for those weeds to grow post-harvest. And so wheat's really a unique crop in that we need to be concerned about what's going to happen post-harvest and keep our focus there, because it really only takes one rainstorm to get that moisture there. If we have that light and that lack of residue, those weeds are going to come, and we need to be after those weeds as soon as we can, otherwise they're going to get out of hand.
Depending on crop rotation, the eco-fallow period, when crops are not growing, is the perfect time to plan how to manage weeds and soil moisture.
Yeah, so depending on our crop rotations, we harvest our wheat crop in July. Oftentimes, folks might plant corn the following year. They might let that sit fallow for a year. It just depends on that particular crop rotation. That fallow period, when we don't have that crop growing, is that eco-fallow, and it's during that period of time we need to be thinking about what we're going to do to manage our weeds and manage our soil moisture. And so we just have to have a plan there. It could be 6 months, it might be 9 months, it could be 18 months that ground is going to sit open, and we need to develop a plan that fits with what our following crop is going to be.
Volunteer wheat is very important to be controlled as it hosts wheat curl mites. Wheat curl mites vector a lot of different diseases that can affect wheat crops.
Yeah, volunteer wheat's the one that we really talk a lot about because that is the host for the wheat curl mite. And that wheat curl mite vectors a lot of diseases. And we've seen, especially this year, where we had a really open fall, a really mild fall, we've had a lot of issues in our wheat crop with wheat streak mosaic, barley yellow dwarf, really prevalent across much of our wheat growing acres this year. And we've had a lot of hail this year as well. Anytime we have pre-harvest hail, that's going to shatter that grain. It's going to have a lot of opportunity to have volunteer wheat growing up. And so we need to be able to control that wheat before we plant our next wheat crop. At least 2 to 3 weeks before we plant that wheat crop, we need to be out there spraying it so we can break that green bridge. And when there's nothing out there that is green for those mites to live on, they're going to die. And that protects our wheat crop in that fall once we get it planted.
Timing and multiple courses of action is important when managing weeds in your crops.
Well, so when we talk about split treatments, we want to make sure that we're getting those good tank mixes. We want to not be just using one herbicide or one mode of action. We want to use multiple modes of action that are effective. We also want to be thinking about timing. So if we spray right after wheat harvest, that will provide us a pretty good window of control for a few months, but we need to be thinking what our next step is going to be. If we're going to weed again, or we'll have to spray again. If we're going to do a different crop, we'll have to spray again in the spring. So we want to think about our crop rotation and make sure that we plan out our treatments so they work well in that crop. And sometimes we have to spray twice in the fall, and then we'll follow it up in the spring. But we want to mix those herbicides up and get those timings right so that we get those weeds when they're most vulnerable.
If weeds aren't managed properly, they will soak up all of the moisture meant for the crops, which can heavily affect next season's yields.
If we have weeds in our field, those are going to be using that moisture instead of our crop. And if we don't control our weeds, that they can use up to 3 inches of soil moisture, which translates into about 30 bushels in our next corn crop.
It's easy to move on from task to task, but it's important not to forget about post-harvest weeds. Managing weeds now can mean for a better crop in the future. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Mike Straub.
Thank you for that story, Mike. If you'd like to learn more about wheat production and ways to improve your operation, you can always find the latest information online at cropwatch.unl.edu. Turning our attention over to the grain markets now, this week we're joined by Heartland Farm Partners President Deb Peterson. The markets were closed for day trade on Monday due to the holiday, but when they opened on Tuesday, it was not pretty. We began the conversation with Deb by getting his thoughts on the reasons behind the big sell-off to start the week.
It starts some time ago, so if we go back to the middle of April, and the reason we go back to that time, Bryce, is that that's a point in time where the funds kind of peaked out. So the funds, or the trend-following funds, the ones who buy the market, they continue to buy if they think the market's going to go higher. They sell it if the market sells off. And we track those positions every Friday. There's a commitment to trade report, but they kind of maxed out their position back there at about 400,000 contracts, which would be about 2 billion bushels. So ever since then, they've been kind of selling this market off, and putting a little pressure on this market. Now, the market had numerous things that were happening during there that would give us some bounces. But then we roll forward, Bryce, and we go to June 17th. And on June 17th, on that Friday, we ended up having a weather forecast that couldn't get much hotter and drier. And actually the market did bounce and the funds did step in and they bought some bushels. But that was a 3-day weekend. We come back in and we start off with that Monday night trade. And ultimately, lo and behold, which happens over the weekends, the forecast changed and start taking some heat out of the market. So all of a sudden you start seeing the funds start backing out. And when that happened, you started seeing some breakdown on the charts. And then what we ended up having is that big ridge that was setting in there. Over time, the forecast looked like it was going to move it back to the south and west, which introduced in some cooler temperatures. And then we started bringing in some more precip. And when that all happened, in amongst all that, though, we had, a big headwind from the talk about a recession. And in addition to that, we had crude oil drop about $10 a barrel. So that all came together to put a lot of pressure on this market price.
Does the move fully justify, in your opinion, though? I mean, all the outside pressure you're talking about that moves the funds, is it justifiable how far we saw things go down on Tuesday?
Yeah, I don't think it'd necessarily be justifiable, no, but unfortunately it's not out of character for a market where we have this much volatility. Part of the other side of the equation may have been the market might have got itself a little bit too high to begin with, and then ultimately the market did what the market does sometimes and overcorrected and came back. Now, had we have not had the recession talk out there, especially with the uncertainty that's still out there about how many bushels are coming out of Ukraine, we wouldn't have seen as big of adjustment as what we did, Bryce.
But you warned us, Jeff, on this program. We've talked it's not a matter of if, it's when things would turn the other way, and that's what the markets seem to do. That's been the past. You set it up well. Talk about where we're at right now with our current situation for these corn and soybean markets. Yeah,
so right now we sit back and let's just look at the 30,000-foot view. First of all, what we have to realize is that we do have more stocks around than we did a year ago on paper. But as we dig into that number deeper, and this is a challenge, if some of the traders don't look past this, we know because of the problems that are going on with Ukraine, with the war with Russia, and ultimately not being able to ship their stocks and ship their corn and their wheat out of the Black Sea, that's not giving the world as much corn as what you'd like to see coming out of Ukraine. So as a result of that, what you've had happen is the fact that as we see those stocks and that tightness, we look to the side and say, well, what about the other supply out there? And that's where the weather comes into play. Weather's still of a concern here yet. We don't quite have the heat in the forecast that we had before, but there's some dryness. We get past these rains, there's still some dryness. And when we look at the weekly crop progress report, there's a number in there that we watch very close. And that's actually the topsoil short to very short percentage. In this last week's report that came out on Tuesday, we physically dug into that number and we said, okay, what percent of the corn and soybean acres in the U.S. are in a short to very short situation or condition or rating? And 47%. And to put that in perspective, when we look back to 2004, the only time for this past week that it would have been a higher short to very short percentage would have actually been back in 2012. Now, I'm not saying we're as dry as 2012, but there's still some dryness. So there's still, this crop isn't made yet, but we've done a lot of damage to the charts, Bryce.
What will it take at this point to stabilize things and even make the market go higher? Well,
really, I think there's two things. First of all, we really need to get that crude oil market to turn around and give us some support. And basically saying get some help from the outside markets. And in addition to that, we need to see some dryness and some heat. If we'd see some dryness and heat in the market, people would get concerned about what the yields are going to be. Because keep in mind, this whole crop hasn't pollinated yet. It's actually just getting started. That would give us a bounce back in the markets. Depending on how hot and dry it is would depend on how far the market would bounce, but that's what it would take, Bryce.
Tell me more about the relationship there, crude oil to commodities. Why is that so important?
Yeah, years ago, if we'd go back in time, if we were sitting here, say, talking 25 years ago, Bryce, we'd say in simplest terms, how do we determine the value of what basically corn and soybeans is worth? And we'd really say, what's it worth for feed and what's it worth for food? But the minute we ended up having renewable energy come into play, what we did is we introduced an energy component. And ever since then, since we introduced that energy component, that is why there's a connection between corn and crude, but also between soybeans and crude because of the biodiesel or methyl ester production that comes out of the soybeans.
Appreciate the explanation. Let's give you the final word this week, Jeff. What kind of marketing advice do you want to offer to our producers watching today?
I think the best thing that we can do at this time, forget about where the prices have been, because that's going to keep us from physically pulling the trigger to sell. Get ready to make a sale. We're going to need to make a sale on a bounce. We're going to have to sell at levels below where we'd have been before, but that's okay. These are still good prices.
Thanks to Jeff for his time this week. Coming up next week, we'll be joined by Doug Simon of Trados. As always, if you have a comment or a question, email us or get in touch on social media. Soon after taking office, President Joe Biden issued an executive order to, quote, tackle the climate crisis at home and abroad, end quote. In it, he established a goal to conserve at least 30% of U.S. lands and 30% of U.S. ocean areas by year 2030, also known as 30 by 30. This proposal has been quite controversial, especially here in Nebraska. To catch up on the latest, we had the opportunity to sit down with UNL Extension Water and Agricultural Law Specialist Deb Aiken. We began by getting his thoughts on how close we are to the 30% of U.S. land goal right now.
Well, that's a great question. And I had to convert all of the stuff that they were talking about into acres to try to get some handle on it. But it turns out that 30% of the land mass of the United States is 681 million acres. So that is the goal then for the 30-30 is to have 681 million acres conserved.
How close are we to that right now? What do your numbers tell you?
Well, that's another great program, and another great question. And they did an update on this program, just over a year ago, and they should have addressed that in that update, but they didn't. So we'll come at it ourselves. That update did say that 12% of the land in the United States was highly protected, and I think that means like permanent protection like a national park or wilderness or something like that. And that implies that, we need to do 2.5 times that to get to the 30% by 30-30. However, 2009 federal protected land inventory includes the statement that 715 million acres of protected lands are held by state, federal, and local agencies and private agencies. That's more than the 30%. In addition, if you look at Indian tribal trust lands, that could be another 56 million acres or up to that amount. And then finally, if you look at conservation easements where landowners agree not to develop their land, that's 61 million acres. So if you add all that together, that's over 800 million acres, and that's about 37%.
So we needed 681 million acres to meet the 30%. You're saying we're over 800 with the numbers you found?
That's right.
So we're at the goal, right?
Yeah, no, and I mean, if I was in charge of this, I'd declare victory and, move on, but it's not up to me. Now, if you want all of the 30% to be this kind of primo habitat, this permanent protected wilderness or whatever, then, we've got a long ways to go, and that would cost millions and millions of dollars. But the climate order from the president and the 30-30 program update both said that USDA conservation programs like the Conservation Reserve Program and other working land conservation programs, that those should count towards the 30% goal. So, it's hard for me to see how we aren't there already. Mm-hmm. Maybe they'll say, well, it should be 50%, not 30%. Who knows?
To that point, what do you think happens with the 30 by 30 initiative and money perhaps allocated here? Do you think that might be a possibility?
Well, frankly, the president's climate program is in big trouble. The funding for it has been held up in the Senate, and who knows if they're going to get something out of that or not. The Supreme Court has just recently ruled to limits what EPA can do in terms of climate regulations. And so I really don't think we're going to hear a lot about 30-30 going forward. I would, however, be fairly confident that we'll see some like urban parks, some urban green space, something like that. That could come out of 30-30. And that's something I think the president might find attractive. But, in terms of, they've already got way more acres than they say they need. So it's hard to see very much happening, really, especially after the midterms. I think it'll be dead after that.
Thanks to Dave for his time this week. If you'd like more insights on this topic, you can watch an in-depth webinar, which is hosted by Dave. It is posted now on the Market Journal website. Summertime is county fair time here in Nebraska. A full slate of more than 90 county fairs held all summer long across the state began this past week with the Madison County Fair in Madison. County fairs, which bring together family, neighbors, and family all across the county for entertainment, competitions, 4-H and FFA events, rodeos, and much more, go all the way through mid-September, with the last county fair in the state being Richardson County in Humboldt. You can get the entire schedule of county fairs in the July issue of the Nebraska Farmer. Well, it is now time for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Well, Al, we had some good weather for the most part over the long holiday weekend, but things have been heating up quickly as they tend to do here in the month of July. How are things looking as we turn to the week ahead?
Well, Bryce, we did see that warm up during this week, and of course we've seen a little bit of the fireworks outside of the 4th of July with the thunderstorm activity that rolled across the state. We were catching in that monsoonal flow riding over top of the ridge that's centered over the southern plains. And of course we see scattered showers and thunderstorm activity. Not as broad-based as what the models were originally forecasting, but those areas that did get into some of the more active weather received some pretty substantial precipitation amounts, particularly that area south central and southeast Nebraska along the Kansas border. Multiple reports of several days of precipitation, anywhere in the 2 to 5 inch range, and then we had pockets scattered throughout the remainder of the state. At the same token, some areas of the southwestern panhandle, parts of southwest Nebraska, small pockets of east central Nebraska, the northern sandhills, and parts of northeast Nebraska were fortunate if they received even a 1/4 inch during this event. So it kind of gives you a broad-based idea of how scattered the precipitation was. As we go forward in time, the heat looks like it's going to return, and unfortunately, precipitation chances themselves kind of drop off dramatically during this week. So let's take a look at the upper air forecast. First thing I'll draw your attention to, the ridge is building back in for this weekend, so the return of the warm and sticky weather looks to be on its way. We should see widespread upper 90s to low 100s in the southwest, and eastern Nebraska probably going to be dipping around into the 90 to 95 degree range. Low pressure moving across southern South Dakota. We'll keep most of the moisture up in North Dakota, maybe an isolated thunderstorm in the panhandle, and then as we go into tomorrow, this ridge starts to be pushed southward as a trough goes across the northern plains. At this point in time, it doesn't look like a lot of moisture with us. We'll see the low pressure moving across northeastern South Dakota. Good precipitation in this region, but nothing in the way in the central plains. And our temperatures will start to cool in the northeast into the upper 80s, and we'll still probably be around 100 in the south. And on Monday, of course, as jet stream starts to dip, we'll start to see high pressure building in. So we will see a cooling trend for a couple days. Still a chance for isolated showers. Most locations of the state should be somewhere in the 80s to around the lower 90s. And then as we get into Tuesday, we start to see that ridge reforming to the west. So we're going to see much warmer temperatures in western Nebraska, probably pushing up toward the 90 to 95 degree range. In eastern Nebraska, we'll still be close enough to that trough, so we may actually still stay in the upper 80s. Just a slight chance of precipitation with a front that will be to the south of us. And then on Wednesday, this high pressure ridge starts to really expand toward the central plains. And we should see upper 90s across the western part of the state, and we'll be probably looking at the low 90s to mid 90s across the eastern part of the state, with very humid conditions as we start to see a little bit of monsoonal moisture moving up the front range of the Rockies. On Thursday, the ridge builds even farther up into the Dakotas. We do see low pressure at the surface trying to develop in eastern Montana, but in terms of precipitation, just nothing in the way of any moisture, as all of it's going to be focused along the Gulf Coast region. And by the time we get to Friday, this high pressure ridge extends all the way up toward the western Great Lakes. Before that trough comes in next weekend, we'll be looking at widespread upper 90s to low 100s across much of the Central Plains region, and it'll be fairly humid, not in the way of monsoonal moisture moving up into the region. Looking a little bit farther out into the future, that trough is going to be staying into place to somewhat over the Ohio River Valley and the eastern Great Lakes. That's going to allow that ridge to keep the warmer temperatures up into the western United States, including Nebraska. And in terms of precipitation, we'll see below normal across the Great Lakes. And as we go to the southwest, we start to notice a monsoon moisture starting to flow northward. And the latest signals show around the 22nd, we'll start to see another trough tapping that moisture and moving into the central plains.
Thank you, Al. Finally today, as the global population continues to grow, we are projected to reach an estimated global population of 9 billion people by year 2050. That means that meat production would need to double over the next 28 years to meet the needs of our ever-expanding population. In fact, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, feed and crop production will also need to increase to meet the needs of livestock. Eventually, resources could become a little bit more difficult to secure. However, there are some unique solutions to growing protein demand, including insects.
Wait, where's the cricket?
We recently caught up with Assistant Extension Educator Hannah Gunther and a few others at a recent 4-H Adventure Day where participating students got some hands-on experience with having crickets on the menu. While most people cringe at the thought of insects in or as our food, the practice of consuming insects has been part of human diets for years. Some say it could be a solution to feeding a growing population.
And you know, too, I feel like so many times we want protein that we want one ingredient items, we want whole foods. Well, these crickets are a whole food. They're an amazing protein source. So I kind of think it's going to be interesting how we just get creative in incorporating them in new ways. You know, like protein bars or a protein powder. You know, like why can't we use them as a topping on Greek yogurt or an addition to, you know, a dip or a trail mix. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, but I definitely think they're going to kind of be making their way into our food supply.
I'm not eating it.
While most kids are always up for some snacks, there was a bit of trepidation among the participants. However, it did appear that the more they learned, the more curious they became.
Chocolate. And you know, kids do get excited about food, but I was like, this is such a cool curriculum to get them excited. That's something entirely new, but we can still talk about protein, but in a really unique way. And not to mention, it's kind of a cool way to talk about foods that are eaten around the world, not just foods that are eaten here in Nebraska. So it was really fun to use. So some kids, you know, I talk about that, you know, okay, we're going to be eating bugs today, and at first they're like, you know, stunned, and they're like, no, I'm not going to do it. But then by the end of it, you know, it's funny, they come up and they get one, and then they come back up for more. So I feel like once we talk about it, the more we talk about it, you know, they were way more open-minded into trying them, which is great.
If you would like to learn more about the benefits of insects or insects as food for humans, we've included an informative link along with this story on the Market Journal website. I'm not sure if I'm sold on that idea just quite yet. Well, that is going to do it for this week's show. If you did miss a story, be sure you're following Market Journal online and that you've subscribed to the Market Journal YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm Bryce Tuskett, wishing you a safe and productive week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.